Stephen Jones is almost synonymous with horror, especially in the UK. A writer, designer, editor, and just an all around careful thinker about horror and fantasy, his anthologies, for instance, have become the platonic form for what a good anthology might aspire to be. Not an eclectic, random, toss everything into the blender and hope it somehow tastes good volume, but instead a book that unfolds like a well planned meal. Each chapter, each course, delicious in its own, but at the same time playing so well with all the courses surrounding it that you can tell that a true connoisseur carefully planned that menu. Sadly, all too few of us get to do what we love in life, but with Stephen Jones, you feel his love and a respect for his subject matter there on the page. It's little surprise that his work has been met with acclaim over the last several decades. He's won multiple British Fantasy Awards, World Fantasy Awards, the International Horror Guild Awards, and so many Bram Stoker Awards they might as well just put a nail in the coffin and rename that award after him. In a year without the horrors of a world pandemic, we would be welcoming him here with us in Chicago. But for now, as a placeholder, and through the sometimes terrifying technological veil of the internet and Zoom, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Stephen Jones. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Peter. I should get you to write my blurbs in future.
Well, it's a real pleasure and honor to have you here, that's for sure.
Well, as I say, the sad thing is that I've now had to cancel my flights to Chicago 4 times since the pandemic, and the most recent time was we should have been coming over at Halloween. We should have been coming over in a few weeks' time to Chicago again. I've got family out there, so I travel back and forth quite regularly. But it was not to be again, so maybe next time.
Yeah, maybe next time. And at Halloween, you were going to be here too. It would have been perfect for us as well. I'm sorry.
Oh, for me it is, because America celebrates Halloween a lot more than Britain does. Although we're getting back towards it now. We always used to celebrate something called Guy Fawkes Night, which tended to fall about the same time. And my birthday is literally a couple of days after Halloween, so it's a big family gathering normally.
Nice. Well, since you mentioned it, maybe we can start there, because I was thinking about maybe starting by asking you, since I'm a philosopher, I try to think about what is the essence of something? What makes that thing the thing it is and not something else? So I wanted to ask you your thoughts about horror as a genre. What is it that sort of sets the boundaries to it? And how do we know what is horror and isn't? But maybe we could start with something you just sort of brought up there, the British versus American way of thinking about things that are scary or horrific. Do you see a big difference in that?
Yeah, let's start with the big questions. Okay. I thought just start off with where do you get your ideas? Yeah. Well, so much. That's half an hour just there. One of the things about horror which attracted me to the genre many, many years ago was I don't think it does have barriers. I think one of the great things about the horror genre, unlike maybe a lot of the other genres, whether it's romance or Western or science fiction or anything like that, is that horror works in all the other genres. But all the other genres don't necessarily work in horror. So you can have a science fiction horror story, you can have a Western horror story, you can have a war horror story. And certainly one of the things I've always looked for as an editor are people pushing those boundaries all the time. I'm not talking about pushing the boundaries in violence or sexuality or anything like that. I'm not a huge fan of extreme horror, although, again, that's another subsection of the horror field. But it's just, I've always found that you can find horror in pretty much any kind of literature. And that always attracted me to it. And movies, and to be fair, movies as well, and TV. You know, Alien is a haunted house movie set on a spaceship. You know, it's an old cliche, but it's true. I remember when I was doing Hellraiser with Clive Barker here back in 1987. When people came down on set, I created a little button for them, and it basically read, "There are no limits." And I think that's true. I still think that's true in horror fiction today. And I think one of the great things about my career and what I've been doing is there are new writers constantly coming in who reinvent the horror field for another generation or another decade and whatever. And so it never stagnates, or at least for me it doesn't. I mean, it goes through rough patches. I believe certainly that horror is cyclical, and maybe for 6, 7, 8 years it will be selling well, and then for another 6, 7, 8 years it will fall out of favor, then it comes around again. And I'm old enough and been doing this long enough now that that's happened several times in my career. It's when I started off, when I started off actually working professionally in horror, it was the end of the 1980s, and that was the 1980s boom. I'm sure you're very aware of how big all that was, and we all thought that was it. It was going to be great, and then by the mid 1990s, that had all gone away, and people had gone off to do other projects and other genres, and very few of us stayed there and stayed true to horror. Certainly in a professional capacity. Here, particularly myself and Ramsey Campbell, have always been very proud to have the word horror on the spine of our book. Not dark fantasy, not dark romance, not dark suspense, and all these other marketing words that people come up with to not say horror. I mean, I'm very much a horror guy. That's what I do. I mean, I don't mind terror. Boris Karloff always said he didn't like the word horror; he preferred the word terror. I personally don't mind; they're interchangeable in my vocabulary, because within those two words, you can do anything. You can literally do anything you want to scare people, or not just scare people, but to unnerve people. And I think that's the difference between British horror and American horror, if you were looking for a difference, if you're actually looking for a difference, because British horror comes out of a literary tradition. I mean, it comes out, if you want to go back far enough, it comes out of Shakespeare and the plays and that kind of stuff, Macbeth and Midsummer Night's Dream and Marlowe's Dr. Faustus and all this kind of stuff. But if we're going to be sensible, then probably we've got to say, okay, middle of the 19th century, you've got Mary Shelley, you've got Robert Louis Stevenson, you've got Bram Stoker. These are the guys who created the tropes for horror, and they're all technically British. I mean, I know Stoker's Irish, but we'll count him as British for this conversation. And they set the barriers, but not the barriers, shall we say, the template for how horror fiction was going to move forward, and horror movies again. At that point, probably late 1800s, early 1900s, you started to see people like Edgar Wallace and others writing that kind of mystery fiction, old dark house fiction, and so there was a blurring of the lines there, which I'm a great fan of, between the detective fiction and horror fiction. You had the plays, you had the early silent movies, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, in the 1920s and 30s, you had M.R. James, who basically just took the horror field, the British horror field, kicking and screaming into the 20th century. And although his stories are normally involve some kind of antiquarian working for a university and stumbling across some historical haunting or whatever, they were written for a contemporary audience. And so they are very much contemporary ghost stories and horror stories. In America, you had the pulps, and you had magazines like Weird Tales and Horror Stories and Terror Tales, again from the 20s through to the 40s. And they were very much a different kind of horror. They were much brasher, they were much more visceral and sexy and in your face. And the covers were much more colorful and had half-naked ladies being menaced by mad scientists and their monsters and things. And it was a much more commercial kind of horror. And I think that's when the split happened. And I think from that point on, the two horrors have been very different. And I personally am a fan of quiet horror. I mean, Charles L. Grant, who was American, and a friend of mine for many years, wrote possibly some of the best quiet horror I ever read. And he invented the term quiet horror. And to be fair, so did Dennis Etchison and Karl Edward Wagner and Peter Straub, and to a certain extent, Stephen King. And that's very much a different kind of horror to the horror we have over here with people like Ramsey Campbell and Brian Lumley, but then again, you've got James Herbert, who's also writing, in-your-face horror of babies being eaten by rats, and Graham Masterton and the late Guyan Smith and all these guys. So I mean, it's just a different. I think we're just coming at it from a different point of view and a different cultural point of view. But at the end of the day, the idea is to give the reader or the viewer a chill, a frisson, something they'll take away with them. The worst kind of horror for me is you read something or you go to movies and watch something, and 5 days later you can't remember anything about it. Yeah. And the amount of stuff I see and read and is sent to me for anthologies and whatever, and I just read it and I end up going, what? Well, who cares? Who cares about that? It hasn't changed me. The story hasn't changed. The characters haven't changed. And a lot of people think they can write horror. A lot of people say, oh, horror, that's easy. Anyone can do that. And I think you alluded to it in your very kind introduction. And also think they can edit horror as well. And it's hard. It's really hard. And one of the things you said about, and I like that very much in your fabulous introduction, was about almost curating an anthology rather than editing it. And the problem is that too many people out there, especially in these days of print on demand and self-publishing and all the other things that are going on out there, Kickstarter and Patreon, is people don't edit anthologies anymore. They compile them. They throw a bunch of stories in a book, just happy to get the stories in some cases. And that's it. Whereas my background is television and movies. I was a TV director for many years. I've worked on movies. And what I like to do is make the book feel like a movie. You want to pace it. You don't want to have all your scares in one place. You don't want to put maybe a story about a haunted house next to another story about a haunted house. You've got to, once you've got your stories and you're happy with your content, then you almost create the ebb and flow of a movie. So the scares, the top scares are there, but the quiet scares are there, and the book flows. You want to open with something that grabs the reader's attention, and you want to end with something that they will remember once the covers are closed and they've gone away. And yeah, of course, I mean, people read anthologies and they just dip into the stories. They read their favorite authors first and whatever, and that's fine. If that's what they want, that's absolutely fine. But every anthology I've ever done has been curated in that way, so that there is an atmosphere, an ebb and flow, and stylistically, it varies through the book. So when I finish a book, I've said this before many times, it is like I've directed the book. The authors are the actors, the performers, and the publisher is the producer. And if you use that analogy, you can take that right through the whole process of editing any book. And they're like mini movies. I mean, sometimes, I work for a publisher and I get paid a reasonable amount of money. I've never been paid a lot of money in my career, but a reasonable amount of money. And that's like an A movie for me. Sometimes I'm working on a book like one of the Mammoth books, which, paperback originals. That's like my little Val Luton B movies. They're the ones I get out, and there's not a lot of money to be paid there, but you can still do something kind of interesting and funky with the book and get it out there, and hopefully the stories will reach an audience. And then I do other stuff, which is my low budget stuff, which is my indie stuff, and that's often because I just want to do it. It's just I want to do the project, and it's a project more for me than it is for anybody else, and it may not be particularly commercial. But as you said in your intro, I love this genre. I grew up loving this genre, and I ended up doing the one thing I've always loved, is working in this genre. And I've done it now professionally for 40 years. And I couldn't dream of that when I was a school kid. I just really couldn't dream of that at all. And to have met all the people I've met and worked with all the people I've worked with, and to have the brag shelf I have downstairs is just unbelievable. And I always say to people, you know, I do what I love, and I love what I do, and it's really true in my case.
It's wonderful. Yeah. My goodness, there's so much in there. I see now we could talk for a week because there's so many questions to ask you about all of that. So let me try to dig back to one of the things you said early on there, and that is that you're happy to have the word horror on the spine for what you publish. So thinking some more about that then. So what is it? How do we know what to put on the spine? In other words, if horror is so wide and it allows so much room, how can we set limits to it such that we know this counts? And to separate it from something that seems to be something different, but yet might have horrific elements to it. So I think, for instance, of you mentioned Alien, and that's the sort of classic example. It does seem like a horror movie. I think of Willy Wonka. For me, there are moments in Charlie where it just seems like Gene Wilder that could be taken straight from a horror movie, the way he delivers his lines. But you wouldn't want to call that a horror movie. And I've seen.
Ah, well, hold on.
No, no,
So first of all, we've got to remember it was written by Roald Dahl,
right?
And Roald Dahl was a horror writer. So of course there's going to be elements of that in his children's stories, and there's elements of horror in Matilda as well, and the BGF and other stories that he wrote over the years, and also like Roald Dahl knows exactly what he's doing when he puts those moments in. No, I wouldn't put the word horror on the spine at all, but I believe that we work in a broad church, and although I am a horror editor, I also work in fantasy and science fiction. I enjoy them. I came into this genre reading science fiction before I ever read horror. I was reading Robert Heinlein and people like that, and John Wyndham, long before I was reading H.P. Lovecraft or Clark Ashton Smith or anybody. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely get what you're saying, and yeah, you couldn't put horror on the spine of those books, but that doesn't mean we can't claim them for our own. It doesn't mean, as I mentioned Shakespeare earlier, I claim Shakespeare as a horror writer or a horror playwright. I claim Christopher Marlowe, but then I claim Mary Shelley or Robert Louis Stevenson, and people who maybe only had a few books or stories within the genre. And that's what I was saying earlier. The lovely thing is the edges blur. Mm-hmm. So you'll find you'll find elements of horror in so many things. One of the things I used to do for my best new horror anthology series was I used to write an introduction every year, which was a summation of horror of the year. And I'm an inclusive guy. I'm not an exclusive guy. I'm an inclusive guy. I like to include everything, and also hopefully introduce people to something they may not have thought about before. So I would include those kind of Willy Wonka things, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, horror beyond belief there. The Simpsons, Treehouse of Horror every year, episodes of Family Guy. All of that stuff is all part of what goes into the mix to become horror. It may not be, your severed limbs or whatever, and that's fine. That's a very much one kind of horror. There's psychological horror, obviously classic Psycho by Robert Bloch and the film by Alfred Hitchcock. As I said, we're a broad church, and I want our congregation to be as big as possible, and maybe cross over. Say, well, I didn't realize that was horror or that was horrific. And that's why I was saying earlier, I think sometimes the term horror is misleading, but when you're doing books, unfortunately, publishers and more importantly, bookstores demand some kind of shorthand on the spine. And it very much in the old days, and they're coming back now, but in the old days, back in the 80s and early 90s, most bookstores in America and in the UK had a designated horror section. Right. And you could go in there and it would be shelves and shelves of black spines with embossed silver lettering on and die cut covers and all this other stuff. It looked fabulous. And some of that is coming back again now, which is great. But that's how the people working in the bookstore know where to put the book. It's where the reader who's just maybe browsing the shelves looking for something to read knows what kind of book to expect. And you can't break it down into subgenres or subsections or whatever. So horror is a handy word as any to put on the spine. And then hopefully they pull the book out, look at the cover, and I'm a great believer that you can tell a book by its cover, and then read the blurb on the back. And if it's something they think might be intriguing or interesting to them, buy it and try it, and then maybe find that they've liked it, and will buy more books either in that genre or by that author, and that's important. One of the things I did very early on when I'm doing anthologies was I made sure that every story had an introduction talking about the author and their other work, so that when the reader has read the story and they like it, maybe they've got somewhere else to go to. They can go, oh, wow, if that was good, I'll go and try that short story collection or that novel or whatever. And again, it's a way of giving back. It's a way of giving back to the genre and saying, okay, well, I've got this, but hey, try this, or try this person, or do this, and whatever. And as I say, we're a broad church. I'm an inclusive guy. I just love horror.
Yeah. But it's interesting that you say in the middle there that it's a shorthand, and that it's to use to know where to put it in the bookstore and how to sell it and how to market it, because it does seem to me that sometimes that philosophy has, at least for the last 2,500 years, been in the business of trying to clarify concepts and universals, but it seems to me sometimes that the concepts that we come up with, they're the end of thinking, not the start of it, because once you have that concept, then it's like you don't have to think about it anymore, because you believe you know a lot about, oh, that's horror, so I know everything I need to know about that, and that's not, right, that's some other genre, and I know about that. And so it kind of limits in some way, because
Absolutely.
you have that label. And so at the same time, I've heard you say, or rather, I think I've read you saying that there are certain subgenres these days, like paranormal romance and things like that, that you don't have quite as much respect for. I think the Twilight novels, maybe True Blood, where would you say that the problem there is not that, well, the problem there is that maybe it's not dealing with some sort of deep, important, universal theme that we're going to remember decades from now, like some of the stuff that you talked about earlier, but also that the horror is not central, that it's just, like Twilight just happens to be about vampires, but it's basically about abstinence, and True Blood.
No, I respect. First of all, I respect anybody who can finish a book. I mean, writing a book. I mean, anybody who can get through writing a novel. I've never been able to do it. I've never particularly wanted to do it, to be honest with you, because I already know people who can write novels a hell of a lot better than I ever could. But so it's not a lack of respect. It's a lack of. It's not even a lack, actually. It's the fact that I sometimes see people jumping on bandwagons. And this is very much what happened at the end of the 1980s, when all those people who were churning out their horror novels about possessed children and haunted houses and all the other stuff that was coming at that time. And they had, as I said, the lovely designed covers. And I blame the publishers for a lot of this, because they were just churning it out and they could not get enough material. So writers were writing dreck, to be honest, for them. And they were just filling the shelves. They were filling the drugstores and the supermarkets and the bookstores with all this stuff. And in the end, it overloaded the industry and it collapsed. I'm not going to diss the Twilight books, because people love them, and they love the movies, and they love everything about them. They don't appeal to me, and they're not technically horror, they're fantasy. And they're using vampires as a word in a way that isn't really vampires. I think we can. I think, even back in the 70s, Anne Rice did the same thing with Interview with a Vampire. It's not really. I mean, it's not aimed at horror fans. It's not aimed at vampire fans. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. I mean, people love it and they buy it, and they bought all those books in droves and saw those movies and everything else. That's fine. It's just not my kind of horror. or my kind of terror or whatever. And I sometimes get the feeling, and this is certainly very true at the moment of television, which has jumped into this, especially, platforms like Netflix, and the CW and things, where they're just churning out this stuff in the hopes of finding an audience somewhere. And for every good show, there's 5 others which last one season and disappear, and deservedly so, in my opinion. But as I said earlier, if you stick with it, the circle will turn, the cycle will turn, the circle will go, and eventually it will come back again, and we'll get horror back again for another 6-7 years, and publishers will be publishing it again, who will be very excited about it, and then the audience will drift away, or the market will become saturated, and something else will be big.
Right.
And I'm afraid that's the history of it, to be honest. And it has been for 30, 40, maybe even 50 years now.
So do you think that the ones that stay around, are they marked not just by a sort of excellence of the craft, like being a really truly great writer and you just happen to be writing horror, but also because they are in horror for a reason? That is, they want the horror to be doing something that maybe something else, some other genre can't do. Thinking about something in a particularly deep or complicated way that is precisely what horror allows that something else doesn't do. And that kind of depth is what marks the things that are going to stay with us. Is that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's absolutely true. The people who write commercial horror because they just want to make money are the same kind of people who write movie and TV tie-in books and gaming tie-in books. That's fine, nothing wrong with that. If you enjoy it, it's a fast book, fast read, you're in, you're out, you're gone. The people who survive, hopefully, are the people who respect the genre, who know the genre, who have read backwards and then read the greats and understand how that works. I have a sign above my desk here, which is a piece of advice to all would-be writers. And it says basically, to know where you are is to know where you've been. And people who come into the genre, and the most recent, the oldest film they've probably seen is Nightmare on Elm Street 7 or something. The most recent book they read was something by Joe Lansdale 2 years ago. No, you've got to go back. You've got to read not just those 3 books I mentioned earlier, not just Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Frankenstein, and also all of M.R. James. But then you also start reading the other stuff as well. You need to start reading Richard Matheson, Robert Bloch, Davis Grubb, all these kind of writers who bring something different, something maybe psychological to horror. And then when you've done that, then you're ready to sit down and do your own work and write your own stories. When I teach, and I do creative writing classes now and again as a guest lecturer, and I give the pupils, the students, a title, and I give them an outline of a story, and I ask them to come up with their own pitch for that. Now, invariably, it's either I Am Legend by Richard Matheson under a different name, Vampires Take Over the Earth, or J. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla.
Really?
And first of all, it's surprising how many people don't recognize those stories from my description. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they say, "Oh, wait a minute, that's such and such," and which is good. But I actually have had people pitch me things where they say, "Well, I've got this idea where this guy's the last guy on Earth, and the world is all vampires, and he's the odd one out." And it's like, I said, honestly, have you never read I Am Legend, published, I think it was 1953 or 55 or something? I mean, you've got to read this stuff before you even start. And it saddens me more than anything. I've just come back from a convention this weekend, and it saddens me more than anything these days that so many people, so many horror fans, so many horror writers don't care about the history of the field anymore, don't care about what went before. All they care about is now. what will make me famous? What will make me money? What can I do? How can I sell my idea to Netflix? How can I sell it to the movies? And I've never been bothered with that. I've never cared about that. I didn't come from any kind of privileged or connected background. I love the genre for what it is and for how it works. And so, as I say, whether I get paid a lot of money for a book or nothing for a book, it doesn't matter. It's the book, it's the work that's important. Right. And I think that's what lasts. I think that's, when I'm long dead and gone, I'm hoping that some of my titles will still be in print or will come back into print again, because as a writer or an editor or an actor or a director or whatever, you're eventually looking for that longevity. You're looking for that immortality. And I want people to, I mean, I'm very lucky. I've done 100, well, nearly 160 books now. And a lot of those books are not only available in foreign editions and translated editions and whatever, but books I did 20, 30 years ago are coming back into print again and again and again. And that's what you want, one, as a career. You want your books to be out there, you know, again and again and again, always stay in print, although that's difficult these days. And secondly, you want people to discover your books maybe years, decades after you're gone. Even if it's a secondhand bookstore and a used bookstore, maybe somebody will go, oh, that's just an interesting cover. I'll pick that up and read those stories. And wow, this was quite cool. Who was this guy? Never heard of him. You know, I'm one of those guys who, you can see some of my office around me. I spend most of my time in this room, and I enjoy it. I mean, I've got obviously, the internet now, which we didn't have when I started out, and I have a lot of friends in the genre who I hang out with when I can. I go to conventions and events when I can, but I genuinely love this field, and I love the people in this field most of the time. And I think that shines through in the books. And if you care about the books, and I think this is true of any genre, not just horror, if you care about what you're writing, if you're Raymond Chandler, if you're Dashiell Hammett, if you know J.T. Edson, if you're any of these people and you're writing genre fiction, you've got to care about the book. You've got to care about what you're doing. And I think that care hopefully shows through, and people will discover it, or even it might be on a subconscious level, it might be on a totally subconscious level, but that's fine as well. I don't mind that at all. And eventually I'll go, oh, actually, yeah, that was a good book. And that's why those books and those authors are still around today, because they cared about what they were doing back then, and that's why they become classics as far as I'm concerned. Right. Does that answer your question? Sorry, I got to be off the track as usual.
Right, and I think we sort of become good at picking up that sort of disingenuous feeling of somebody not really loving what they're doing, but doing it for some other reason. And I think a lot of what you said earlier, too, about the way in which we don't really know history, it's one of the big challenges of our culture these days, where history is what happened last year. And that's kind of the farthest we tend to look back. I think in some ways that's probably driven by late capitalism, because there's more to sell constantly. It's something, you keep turning it over, you have a new product all the time, and you don't have to go back to the classics then, so don't bother to read those.
And that's actually a very good point, Peter. I mean, when I was growing up, we didn't have all these distractions of even video. I think in England we had 3, maybe 2 television stations back then. And so books and comics and magazines were the way out. So you did read the books, and then you collected the books and you put them on a shelf and you maybe reread them. And at one point, I had a eureka moment not too long ago where I went, why have I got all these books now? I used to use them as reference tomes to find stories to go in anthologies and whatever. It's all on the internet now. I don't actually need a library technically anymore, except for the beautiful books and the beautiful dust jackets and maybe the signed copies and whatever, because it's all at our fingers pretty much now. But even though that's true, people still don't go back and look at those things. And you're absolutely right. It's not just horror. It's culture as it is at the moment. It's a disposable culture. It's of the now, the moment culture. So even things like history, geography, these kind of things are being forgotten. They're not being taught properly in schools. And so you end up with people who don't know nothing. And that's the problem at the end of the day. And you know, if they're going to read a book set in a foreign country or at a different time, it's just going to confuse them unless they know something about those periods and that and those areas. And it saddens me, really. It really does. I mean, I wasn't great at school, but I learned a lot of what I know from books and from movies, to be fair. But you know, back in the day, I read voraciously since I was a preteen. And now you know, you see people saying, I can't read that book, it's too long. And my heart sinks. I mean, that's why I kind of hope maybe doing anthologies, you know, amongst all the other stuff I do, maybe they will get an anthology and can actually read a short story now and again and dip into it and find something they like. But this whole idea, I think I saw somewhere a couple of years ago where a publisher was doing condensed versions of books for people who couldn't be bothered to read the entire book. And I'd just like to slap those people, to be honest with you, because they're just pandering to what I consider a sickness. I mean, it's a sickness, and it's a cultural sickness, and it's only going to get worse. You know, it's the idea that, well, I was going to say movies and TV shows are becoming shorter and shorter, but they're not. I mean, the new James Bond film is about 2 or 3 hours, I see today. Right. So, you know, movies are getting longer and books are getting shorter. So what does that tell you? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So maybe we can go back a little bit to thinking about those timeless classics, or the ones where the author truly loves what she or he is doing, and then to think a little bit about what marks it as horror. Then, what do you think horror is able to do better, maybe than other genres? Does it help us think about things that are liminal, that are sort of at the edges of our vision? Does it help us think about things that are so overwhelming that if we confronted them head on, we would just sort of fall into an existential abyss? So we have to sort of get at it through art. What would you?
Well, a couple of things. Well, first of all, obviously horror is broken down to subsections, and the everything is too amazing, and I can't, you know, face it. That's what we call cosmic horror. That's the Lovecraftian horror, where there's outer gods. There are forces beyond man's reason. Algernon Blackwood, M.P. Shield, H.P. Lovecraft, all these guys wrote about these forces that were bigger than man, coming to Earth and invading the Earth in different ways, or being brought back through the gates and whatever. And that cosmic horror is, of course, it plays to a basic fear we all have, which is what is there after death? What is out there? What is going to happen to us? Are we just here for our 60, 70, 80 years on this planet, or is there something bigger than us? Is there something more important than us? So that's obviously a very, very important you know, question that none of us can answer. We can come up with various concepts and ideas, and Lovecraft himself came up, you know, with tentacled winged aliens living under the ocean and whatever. Then you have the psychological thing, where it's the complete opposite, is what's going on up here. Can I trust what I'm thinking? Can I trust what I'm seeing? Can I trust what I'm saying? Is it me really saying these words, or is it something else in there? Is it something else? Have I changed and don't know I've changed? And that's the fear of dementia and Alzheimer's and things like this. Again, very much a basic fear, and it's another thing that plays to the human condition. When I was doing books, certainly in the 80s and 90s, I very much said that good horror, and you know, there's a lot of bad horror out there, but good horror reflects the world around us. It reflects what's going on today. Just as the horror stories we talked about, you know, Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, Stevenson, reflected their times. We look at them as history now, but you've got to read them as if they were contemporary books, and they were aimed at a contemporary reader, and what was going on in Victorian Edwardian England plays into those stories, which we forget a lot of the time now. So certainly in the 80s and 90s, when there was such political upheaval in both the UK and the USA, and even before that with the Vietnam War and stuff like that, a lot of horror fiction reflected those fears, those terrors. And I think that's one of the great strengths of horror fiction. And a good horror writer will get their ideas from real life, from newspapers, from TV, news and things like this. There's plenty of stuff going on in the world now where you can just take that and extrapolate from it and take it that one step further and put it into fantasy, horror, science fiction, whatever your bag is in that respect. It's certainly true of science fiction, although again, I think the actual proper definition of science fiction is it actually predicts what's going to happen in society, especially if you're looking at somebody like Philip K. Dick or those kind of writers who actually, Arthur C. Clarke, who were trying to predict what was going to happen. Whereas I think horror is sort of a dystopian version of what is happening and what is happening now. So that the reader, so even though you can have, obviously the big thing has been in the last few years, the zombie apocalypse. Right. And we've all just lived through our own zombie apocalypse. And in fact, one of the things about, when the COVID outbreak came last spring, was I looked at it and used my knowledge of zombie apocalypses to work out what I was going to do. I'd done a series of books called Zombie Apocalypse back maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I'd based the whole timeline, it's about 7 books in the series. I'd based the entire timeline on the SARS outbreak a few years before. So I knew how fast this was going to take off once it hit and how quickly it would spread around the world. And I wasn't far off because I'd already done the math. I'd already worked it out on paper. I also knew what kind of survival kit to put together. I knew that there would be food shortages. I knew there would be fuel shortages. I knew all of this stuff from what I had done basically as a fictional thesis of what would happen in a zombie apocalypse in the UK in the 2000s. As I said, we can learn from this stuff. And so horror fiction is very much, the horror fiction I like to see is very much a reflection of real life. So that when you do step beyond those boundaries, when you do step through that door into the twilight zone, you take what you know and what your experience is with you. And that becomes much, much more frightening and much, much more disturbing because it's rooted in real life. Right. Fantasy is not, obviously. Most fantasy is basically in another world, a different being, a different set of rules, actually, literally in a lot of stuff, a different set of rules. Whereas horror is good horror is very much grounded in reality and what's going on around you. So that when something breaks through those barriers or when something changes within you or the people you know, and this is a very good thing as well, then that's when the horror sets in. And I think a very good example of that kind of horror are things like Invaders from Mars, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that kind of horror, although those are science fiction movies, but it's when everybody else around you changes and nobody but you can see that. Right. And that is absolutely terrifying. And not from a psychological point of view, when it becomes true. Right. And so, as I say, there are so many ways that you can take one basic idea and take it multiple different directions, and different authors can do that. And of course, that's one of the strengths of the themed anthology. Is I've done quite a few in my time. Is you give authors the same theme and see where they run with it. And the chances are you give 100 authors the same theme, you'll get 100 very different stories.
That idea that you just said of everybody being different except for you, everybody having a different point of view, made me think of the movie Gaslight, where you're sort of being groomed to think that you have your own take on reality and everybody else is seeing something different. That's a terrifying, horrific notion. to think that you're so alone, that your experience is so fundamentally cut off from everybody else's, that you're so completely different. And maybe that, tied with mentioning like vampires and ghosts and zombies, or something more psychological, as you said, like Henry James, Turn of the Screw sort of scary stuff, is that these are all these are all things that really are terrifying for us, that are coming out of our everyday experience and everyday worries. But then through the art, we're able to think about them in a way that is not, in some sense, so personal that it feels immediately like it's happening to you really right now. But it gives you that little bit of sort of narrative space to think it through with the character, to think it through with the story, and to allow you to sort of sort those things out in your own life as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's literally you're one step away from the Twilight Zone.
Right, right.
And most people don't step across that barrier, that doorway. But when you do, it just takes one small change for things to start to unravel. There's the wonderful Ray Bradbury story, A Sound of Thunder, which is technically a science fiction story because it involves time travel and whatever. But it's a group of hunters are taken back on a trip to the prehistoric time to hunt dinosaurs, but they're not allowed to step off the path. And one guy panics and steps off the path and runs through the jungle and gets back. He gets finally caught and is admonished by the travel people. They go back to their present, which is our future, and they find everything has changed. It's now a totalitarian government in a dystopian future, and all because they find on the bottom of his shoe a crushed butterfly. And just as something as simple as that, the death of one butterfly has such far-reaching effects. And that is a horrific idea, but it's true that one thing can lead to another thing, can lead to another thing, till you get a cascade where everything has changed. I mean, one of the films I just mentioned, Invaders from Mars, and of course, this is a great childhood fear, is your parents are not your parents. I had the fear when I was growing up. There was a point, I got to a point where I thought, no, those parents are acting weirdly. They're a little bit different from what I remember, or they're not quite the same, and whatever. Right. And it's a standard, probably Freudian childhood fear. But there have been movies that have played upon this and stories that have played upon this, and the opposite way around. Of course, the most famous one is your child is not your own. Your child is possessed or by a spirit. I mean, The Exorcist is a great example of that. And books like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby, of course, reinvented horror for the 70s. They were the books that came at the end of the 60s and reinvented that whole genre for another 10 years and gave it impetus. And again, both are very much grounded, both The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby are very much grounded in the world of today. One is set in contemporary New York and one is set in contemporary Washington. But they both take an idea, the same idea basically, and go with it different ways. And it again created such an impact at the time, both through the books, but more so, of course, through the movies, that it basically changed society for decades.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. And one of the brilliant things about Rosemary's Baby for me is that the end shows that they're sort of all in on it. And there's a kind of banality to that evil, where it's just these, regular people living in the building. But actually, we're Hail Satan. That's like Hail Satan. And
well, again, I think the interesting thing about that, and it's one of the first books I can remember that did that, is anybody that Rosemary can trust is taken away from her. They get killed. The doctor, everybody else. So basically, slowly but surely, she is left alone. There's a terrific 1943 movie by Val Lewton called The Seventh Victim, which is absolutely the same story, where Kim Hunter goes to New York, the same sort of brownstone buildings and smart set people, looking for her lost sister. And as the film very slowly, and it's very like all Val Lewton movies, it slowly unravels. she discovers that her sister was part of a satanic cult in this particular brownstone. And it's a pretty grim movie. And of course, the end of Rosemary's Baby, as you say, is Hail Satan. It's, you know, it was one of the first movies of that period, late 60s, counterculture, Easy Rider, all that kind of time period, where suddenly in horror films, evil wins out. There is no redemption. There is no good ending or happy ending. Evil wins. That's it. And we went through a big stage of that many years ago where books and movies were all like that, where basically it was nihilistic. You know, it's like, oh God, you know, you get through reading 130 pages of a novel or an hour and a half in a movie theater, and you come out thinking, God, what was that about?
I also love the idea that maybe what it points to is that somehow they're not these pockets of evil, but rather the system as itself is the evil, and we are all participating in it. That's one of the things that I take from that movie. I think, well, in what sense am I sort of part of this cult, but I don't realize it in everyday life? After all, I am part of a civilization that is slowly killing the earth and poisoning the planet and killing off animals right and left and harming people overseas that I don't even know so that they can make this computer. And so in some ways, I'm kind of hailing Satan all the time just by living this everyday life. But by pointing to that sort of banality of it, or the we're all in on it, that's a really terrifying moment. It always makes me think. For some reason, I always think when I think of Rosemary's Baby, I always think of that Rolling Stones song, the "Sympathy for the Devil."
Yeah, the devil. Yeah,
Sympathy for the Devil. But when you listen to the song, you realize, well, I shouted out who killed the Kennedys, but after all, it was you and me. It's just this idea. Well, there's no like devil we can pin everything on. It's that we're all participating in this horror in some way, and that's a truly horrific realization.
and also I think you touched upon there the banality of horror.
Yeah.
That's the truly frightening thing, is that it does creep up on us, literally and figuratively. And so you may not see it, you may not recognize it, you may not even know it's coming until it's too late. And that's one of the great tropes and ideas of horror. Is, you know, everything begins fine, you move to the lovely farmhouse, everything's good, and then slowly but surely, in very small increments, things start to change and go wrong until suddenly it becomes overwhelming. And it could be, you could class it as a cliche if you wanted to, or it's just, as I say, it's one of the tropes. And for me, I love those things. I love those moments where you think, oh, that's harking back to that, or they know what they're doing there and they've put that in just so you notice it and whatever, or they've gone a different way with it. And that's, again, the truly good filmmaker or the truly good writer knows that stuff because they've seen those films, they've read those books, and they'll put a little bit of that in there as a homage or as a wink or whatever. Not saying, hey, look how clever I am or whatever. It's just they love those ideas and they'll reuse them in a different way or slightly different way in their own work, to add to the body of work. And I think I love all that stuff. I love people who know what they're doing and go back and do that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, I think selfishly, I can go on talking to you for hours and hours too. But to sort of respect your time and bring things to a close, you hinted earlier that you might be willing to tell me the secret to editing. Maybe you've already said it about loving.
Oh no! There's a very good secret. I mean, as you know, I do a lot of. I've done a lot of anthologies. I also do a lot of non-fiction books as well, and the editing is kind of interesting, but it's the non-fiction stuff is what I enjoy doing because it's research. I adore research, and I adore finding things out that maybe other people haven't found out. If you can add one little piece of knowledge to the genre, or I'm afraid to say nowadays, rediscover a little piece of knowledge that people maybe have forgotten, then I find that very rewarding and very worthwhile. The anthologies are much more sort of entertainment thing. They're much more fun for me. And I do want to make sure that everybody understands, I find this fun. I enjoy. I want my authors to have fun. I want my artists on the covers to have fun, because I have fun with it. It's not, I'm not, I'm not some crazy guy who dresses up, at Halloween and goes out with a scythe or anything. Just a normal guy. But I want to have fun with what I do. And I'm often asked, oh, well, how do you edit? What's the secret of your editing success? Now, I say I'm not a top seller. I'm not a big seller. I've never had a New York Times bestseller, for example. What I am is a very good mid-list writer and editor. And my stuff does well enough, not all of it, but some of it does well enough that I get another book. And then I get, that does well, somebody give me another book. I'm not up here, so I've never earned the big bucks. And that's good, because once you do that, you're ready for a fall. You're ready to, everybody's waiting, 3 more books, and then your advances start to go down a bit. Your publicity starts to go down. I'm just one of those guys who just does that. And to say, sometimes there's a book that does well, sometimes there's failures. And trust me, there's been a lot of failures over the years. Books I love, books I adore, which didn't find their audience or published badly or had a bad cover or whatever. And that's why I was saying earlier, you hope that one day those books will come back again and maybe find the audience they missed the first time around, maybe with a different cover, a different publisher, and a different format. But it's a very interesting, it's taught to me, and I will pass it on quite happily. Anybody who wants to be an editor, not a compiler, not somebody who just throws a bunch of stories together and thinks that's it, but the most important thing you can do with an anthology, any anthology, whether it's horror or anything else, it's the material you don't include that makes it a strong anthology. I see so many times with anthologies, especially in my genre, or magazines, people are just so pleased they got a story from someone, they bung it in, they throw it into the book or the magazine. I'm not even talking about putting it in order or getting a feel for the flow. They're happy to accept it. If an author sends them a reprint or the bottom of the drawer story they couldn't sell anywhere else, they'll use it. You can't do that, not to make a good book. And I sometimes have to go, what, I love this story, I love this writer, but this story is not going to work in the book for multiple reasons. It may not be quite what I was looking for. It might be I already have a story that's got a similar theme by a different writer, which I think works better. And, there's many, many reasons. But it's what you cut out makes the anthology stronger. So you've got to be ruthless as an editor. And I know it hurts me greatly to turn down friends, to turn down good work, but I'll always try and advise people where to take that work and get it published and whatever. But the more you hone it down, the better the material that's left behind, and then hopefully the better the finished book, because it's stronger, it's more powerful, and hopefully it has a bigger effect on the reader. And also, keeping it to a reasonable size as well. If you do a monumental, I'm sure you've seen this in novels. If you do a 500-page novel and weary the reader, it might not be good as a good 150-page novel, a good snappy, fast novel. And so you've got to find a good balance in everything. And balance is true in everything, and especially in horror. And I think keeping it to a certain length, not wearing the reader out, and also at the end of the day, just picking the stuff you think is the best, not just because you've got it, not just because somebody's offered it to you. You will get the best book you can, and that's all I ever want. It's my name on the spine at the end of the day. It's got edited by or compiled by on there. I have to take responsibility, not just for the good stuff, but for the bad stuff or the indifferent stuff as well. So, it's the auteur theory, another whole conversation. The auteur theory goes back to that film idea I said earlier, that when you craft a book or any project, the ultimate responsibility lies with you as the creator, and you have to be able to stand up and say to anybody why you would defend a particular book. And I've always been able to do that. I may be wrong, I may be right, but if I don't believe in it, why should anybody else?
It makes a lot of sense. Wow. That ability to say no and to follow a vision of the thing being the best thing it can be when there are all these other competing forces on you, like a friend wanting something in, or even you liking something, but it might not fit this particular vision. That takes a lot of strength, I think, and a lot
It
of
takes a lot of courage, I'm afraid. If you're just starting out, yeah, maybe you are a little worried about that stuff. But I've got to a point now where I design my own covers, I write my own blurbs when I'm allowed to. And I argue. I mean, I argue with publishers a lot of the time. I will challenge things and say, no, that's wrong. You can't do that. You can't say that. You can't call it that. And I have a certain reputation, mostly for being a hard ass, but I have a certain reputation in the genre, and so why not use that leverage when you can to make the project as good as it can possibly be, because it's going to be sitting on my shelf for the rest of my life, and it's going to be out there in the real world. And once you put your head up above that parapet, you have to expect the good criticism and the bad criticism at the same time, because you're not going to please everybody. You're not going to appeal to everybody, right. And you can't expect to. So the only person you can appeal to is yourself at the end of the day. And if you're happy with the book or the film or whatever it is you're doing, then that's fine. That's what you've got to be confident about, because everything else will flow from that. And as I say, I've done books which I've believed 100. I thought, oh, this is the one. This is one that's going to make me, a bestseller or whatever. And the book has died. It has flopped. So what the hell do I know?
A wonderful place to stop, and with hopes that those 1,000 other conversations that I want to have with you will actually happen too. It'll be great to have you here live someday with us.
Yeah, I would love to do it. I'd love to come out and see you guys. I enjoyed this, as I said to you earlier. As far as I'm concerned, you're talking about my two favorite things, horror and me. And I can just talk about this stuff forever. I can just talk about this stuff forever. But I hope it inspires some of your students. I hope it inspires people to read horror who may not have read horror before. And I hope, as always, that maybe it inspires one or two people to try their own hand at it at some point, because it's no gag to say the horror genre always needs new blood. And, it's not a cliche. We do need it, because that's how it grows and survives and flourishes. So, what you're doing is great. Let's hope people enjoy this. And I'm happy to come back any other time.
I definitely did. Thank you so much, sir.
You're very welcome. Take care.